Welcome to Embargoed, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade, for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I'm your host, Tim O'Toole, and today we have two guests. Melissa Burgess is a returning guest. Welcome back, Melissa.
Thank you, Tim.
And Collmann Griffin is joining us for the first time. Collmann is a longtime Miller and Chevalier person who took a nice break and went into government for a few years and is now returned back to Miller and Chevalier. And this is his first time on the podcast. Welcome, Collmann.
Great to be here, Tim.
It's really good to have you. And today we're going to talk about a topic that touches on both areas of your government service, OFAC and BIS. We're going to talk about what happens when a sanction program dies. That is, what happens when the U.S. government decides that one of its sanctions programs is no longer needed. You know, sanctions are put into place to change behavior. When the behavior changes, or sometimes when it doesn't change, the sanctions programs end, and sometimes they don't. See Cuba. But we're going to talk about today a sanctions program ending because on May 14th, 2025, President Trump announced that the Syria program was going to end, which, you know, the circumstances of the announcement might have been a little bit unique, but the circumstances in which the program is ending really are not. I mean, this program was put in place because of some of the actions of the Assad government, and the Assad government has now been overthrown, and so the Syria program is going to end. And we thought it would be a good idea to talk about what happens when you end a sanctions program, because as of June 6, 2025, the Syria program is still in place. So kind of what sorts of questions do you need to ask? What steps do you need to follow? Kind of what's your to-do list? But before we do that, we're going to talk a little bit about history, and then we're going to kind of talk about what we think might happen with the Syria program. The two are related because sometimes past is prologue. So looking back at some of these programs might help us inform what will come with Syria over the next months and years. So with that, before we get to Collmann and talking a little bit about how the Syria program itself might be unwound, Melissa, I think you have some fun facts about sanctions program history and how programs end.
Sure. So rolling back about 106 years is when we got the end of the first sanctions program implemented under the Trading with the Enemy Act. So in 1917, the president had issued an executive order pursuant to the Trading with the very new, like 6-day-old Trading with the Enemy Act. At that time, sanctions were generally imposed on anyone who is an enemy or an ally of an enemy, which meant we had a declaration of war against the country in question. So roll forward to the Paris Peace Conference, and via a proclamation, not even quite an official executive order, President Wilson lifted the sanctions that had been in place. And so the effect was essentially that all orders, rules, regulations that had been issued between October 1917 and at that point, June 26, 1919, are lifted with an exception. And that exception applied to that part of Russia now then under control of the so-called Bolshevik government. So there we have our first kind of imposed with a statutory authority executive order, lifted under those same authorities, but we weren't quite ready to just wipe the slate clean. We wanted to hold something back.
So that is past and prologue, because those are the questions that they're still asking in terms of winding down sanctions programs.
So that was all under the authority of Section 5B of TWEA, which is really the authority we're still working with today, just in its modern form for most sanctions programs under IEEPA. So then we can kind of roll forward in this history tour, if we want, to the passage of IEEPA. And at that time, we had several different sanctions programs in place, one of which is still in place today. So at that time, we had China was subject to an embargo and comprehensive sanctions under TWEA, Cambodia as well, North Korea, North and South Vietnam, and Cuba. All of those programs were in place put in place at different times. Each had its own little variations. But in 1976, 1977, when Congress was debating IEPA, they kind of punted on the question of, yeah, we don't really think all these sanctions programs are necessary. Is that emergency still really there? But we're going to solve the presidential power question and punt the sanctions wind down question. So with China, which is an interesting program because it was very long standing and didn't have an easy or fast wind down. We had sanctions in place 1950-ish. The thaw started in 1969, Nixon in China. But the sanctions were extensive because it was more than a trade embargo. It was, full arms embargo, no travel whatsoever, all these things. So in the unwinding process, it was, you can travel now, you can do this now, you can do that now, but all these other bits stay. And it wasn't till January 31st of 1980 when the China sanctions in OFAC's regulations finally came off and the China program was essentially formally lifted. And ever since then, there's kind of been a little trouble history there. A lot of debate.
Still an arms embargo and a couple other remnants, but ancient history. Let's talk about today. So Collmann, the OFAC and maybe BIS too are going to have some thinking to do about kind of how to wind down the Syria program and maybe kind of what is going to be left of it when it's wound down, and maybe big pieces like the China program are still left, or maybe it all goes away and becomes almost nothing. So why don't you talk a little bit about Syria and some of the things that our friends at OFAC and BIS are thinking about right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very interesting to sort of watch this process play out again in Syria after the fall of the Assad regime. So just quick background: Syria was also a comprehensive sanctions program, import restrictions, export restrictions, restrictions on services, investment, blocking of property of the government of Syria and persons added to the SDN list. There was also a statutory element here. The Caesar Act imposed mandatory derivative blocking sanctions on persons determined to be part of to have engaged in human rights abuses, and then other relevant Syria sanctions statutes. And then there's a BIS side, an export embargo on all items subject to the AR, except food or medicine. And so we saw the announcement from the president while he was in Saudi Arabia that all sanctions on Syria are going to be lifted. And then very quickly, we saw a general license issued by OFAC, which authorized transactions that would otherwise be prohibited under the Syria sanctions regulations. So this includes imports, exports of services, investment, dealings with certain economically critical persons that remain blocked: government of Syria, Central Bank of Syria, Commercial Bank of Syria, Ministry of Petroleum and Mineral Resources, the Four Seasons in Damascus. And so essentially they're sort of still blocked, but you're authorized to deal with them.
All right, so we talked a little bit about kind of the general license, and that general license came into play because it can be used to modify whatever sanctions were imposed by executive order. So essentially, OFAC imposes sanctions under an executive order that is issued by the president. OFAC can grant a general license, essentially repealing them or mostly repealing those statutes for some time period, and they could go on forever, presumably, but they usually do it for a limited time period. But you mentioned that some of the sanctions were imposed by statute. What are the mechanisms if you want to lift the sanctions that are imposed by statute? What sorts of mechanisms go into place?
So that's a great question. We've seen that a little bit with Syria. So under many sanctions programs, Iran is a great example. There's statutes that require the president and therefore OFAC to impose certain sanctions. But usually there's a waiver process. So the president can waive that requirement to impose sanctions, often while issuing a waiver to Congress with some sort of national security determination. So there is a waiver here in the press release accompanying the issuance of General License 25. OFAC also mentioned the waiver under the Caesar Act. So the president has submitted the waiver to Congress, to the appropriate committees, and then does not have to impose those statutorily required sanctions for a period of time. Here it's 180 days, and then they'll have to submit another waiver.
Got it. Okay, so that's kind of the sanctions part. And the way Syria is set up, like a lot of programs are set up, OFAC imposes sanctions mostly related to services, often focused on financial services. And then BIS imposes an embargo related to the stuff that you talked about with respect to 746.9, and basically everything has a licensing requirement except food and medicine. Those are still in place, right?
That's correct. Under 746.9 of the EAR, there's still a general export embargo on all items subject to the EAR.
Got it. So what happens to those? I mean, what if, assume the president, when he was lifting sanctions, wanted to lift the special export controls or this sort of kind of extensive licensing requirement for Syria? Like, how does that happen?
So that's also tied to a statutory process. Here, the issue is likely that Syria is designated a state sponsor of terror, which triggers certain economic restrictions imposed by the president. In the case of Syria, one of those is this full-on export embargo. So there'll be a process sort of similar to what we saw in Sudan, which I think we'll talk about in a bit, where the president will make a certification to Congress about a fundamental change in leadership practices or something similar. And then after that, they can take the steps to amend the EAR to remove the export embargo.
Right. And so until the president lifts the state sponsor of terrorism designation, you can't change the EAR because the state sponsor designation prohibits all of these items from going to areas where the government is a state sponsor. All right, so that's basically Syria and kind of what's to come. I guess those processes are underway. Why don't we talk a little bit about kind of what we've seen in other regimes, more recent ones than the ones Melissa talked about, that get undone, because this is not the first time that a sanctions program has been undone. And Collmann, you just talked about Sudan. Do you and Melissa want to just chat a little bit about what happened with Sudan and Myanmar, because those are probably the two most recent sanctions programs that have died.
Yeah, of the not easy ones.
Right.
we have a couple comparatively easy. West Bank imposed executive order, lifted by executive order. Everyone's off the list, no big deal. Zimbabwe was a little more interesting in terms of there were a few executive orders, and then to lift it, they redesignated 11 people under the Global Magnitsky program. So again, it was that decision of the reason for this executive order, maybe we're okay with lifting, or other reasons we're okay with lifting the executive order, but if we're not so sure about these individuals, let's keep them blocked. Like with Syria, we're keeping people blocked.
It's a great point. I mean, so some programs are easier to dismantle than others, right? I mean, if you have a program that's pretty simple, like the ones you just mentioned, like the ICC, which is been born, died, and has now been reborn again, I think in the last couple of days. But most sanctions programs that we think of as kind of the embargoed or heavily sanctioned jurisdictions, they're a little harder to unwind.
Yeah.
So
the more restrictions we have, the more we have to think about what we're walking back and when and how.
Right. And that's why it's so important to figure out at the beginning, okay, so what are we talking about? Like, do we have executive orders? Do we have statutes? Do we have state sponsors of terrorism designations? And for Sudan, we had all of those. For Myanmar, we had some, right? So why don't we talk a little bit about Myanmar, which died right at the end of the Obama administration in October of 2016, or at least started towards that end at the end of the Obama administration, at the beginning of the first Trump administration.
Sure, I can take that away. There were a few different executive orders in place. There are also statutes in place there. A bit like Syria, there were tiered restrictions, or even like Russia today, imports of certain items more restricted than everything generally. But the president first signs an executive order that's, in this case, because they're IEPA and National Emergencies Act based, we terminate the emergency, and then we kind of have the automatic effect of, that means sanctions are lifted if the emergency is no longer there. And then we have to make sure of all those restrictions imposed by the executive orders, that we have to make sure we're also lifting each of those restrictions to the extent it's not obvious. So for instance, if we have visa restrictions that were a part of that, then let's make sure we clarify, those visa restrictions are lifted too.
And it seems like, we talked a little bit about this with Syria in terms of the general license, but in all of these programs, part of the calculus is what needs to remain, right? So in Syria, Collmann, you mentioned the general license. It left some stuff in place. Do we think that's kind of a good indicator of what might stick around after the rest of the Syria program dies?
Yeah, that's a great point, both for Syria and for Burma, Myanmar. For Syria, sort of very quickly, they were very intentional not to remove sanctions on certain bad actors that are still operating in Syria. In the press release, they described them as terrorist organizations, perpetrators of human rights abuses and war crimes, drug traffickers, or members of the former Assad regime.
Got it. And so those probably aren't going away even after the rest of the program goes away. And Libya, which was another relatively recent sanctions program that used to be much more robust, there's still members of the Gaddafi family that are still on sanctions lists. When I advise clients on the Libya program, I'm like, the first question is, who are you dealing with, and is the name Gaddafi? Because if it is, you might have some trouble. If it's not, you're probably in the clear. We'll do a little search and make sure. But I think I looked once, and 2/3 of the names that were still on the list were Gaddafi. So the Assad folks probably aren't going away anytime soon. One thing that jumped out at me from the Myanmar kind of dismantling, and ultimately it has come back, which we could talk about another time, as to some of these zombie programs that get dismantled and then get rebuilt. But basically, it seemed to be a different process than they're doing for Syria, because there wasn't a general license. I'm guessing that had to do with the fact that I don't think there was ever a state sponsor of terrorism designation for Myanmar, so you could do this all either by waiver or executive or executive order, or with some sort of notice in the Federal Register, but you could just revoke the EOs, as opposed to when there's a state sponsor of terrorism program, you have to have a parallel process that takes a while.
I think that's generally right. It's easier to do a general license when there's, if you have a statutory process that you have to work out before you can remove sanctions, you can use a general license as a sort of stepping stone to provide relief while you do that. especially if the president in Saudi Arabia has said we're going to lift these sanctions as soon as possible. The other reason, though, is it also provides, it gives OFAC a little bit of leverage because it's sort of more easy for them to just revoke a general license at the turn of a hat rather than reimpose an executive order or something like that. I'm not sure that that's what's going on in Syria, but that's just another reason they may consider that option.
No, it makes sense. I mean, even with Myanmar, my recollection is that the EO, President Obama signed an EO, but then I think that President Trump had to do something as well afterwards, after he took office. I know that happened with Sudan, that it actually crossed over with both, but I'm not sure that the EO, even in Myanmar, was fully in place at the time that President Obama left, because, I think there's kind of a, we're going to do this, but you also want to wait kind of some sort of period so that you can make sure that what you thought was happening in that country doesn't immediately go away.
Yeah. Sorry. I was going to say the announcements for Syria really are hinting at that of, we're giving you this leash, use it wisely because we're watching.
And I did also just, one sort of small point is that there are still sanctions applicable to Myanmar. The sort of buried in the EAR in the military end user restrictions, the military of Burma is one of those military end users. So there's sort of like a little export embargo just on the military of Burma. And then there's also Executive Order 14014, which authorizes sanctions on the jet fuel sector of the Burmese economy. So this is a very sort of targeted issue where jet fuel is flowing to the Burmese military and they want to stop it. And so then they come up with a new executive order to address that. But so even after the big sanctions program has been taken down, there's often sort of little remnants floating around that you have to be aware of.
Yeah, and 14014 I think came into place, after they'd been lifted, just when the military, which had, we thought in 2016 had been kind of put where we hope militaries will be, which is the defense force, but that the government is going to be run in a civilian manner. The military came back and staged, an overthrow of the government, and sanctions were put back into place, but it was much more limited than the ones that were in place in 2016, and they've pretty much remained limited. They've focused, on the military through 744.21, and then also through this executive order that I guess there is some connection between the jet fuel sector and the Burmese military that OFAC and the government know about, and I'm not sure a lot of other people do. You don't usually think jet fuel, it must be a bunch of Burmese generals.
Maybe that's why we're not in OFAC.
So let's talk a little bit about Sudan, because I think Sudan might be the closest parallel to Syria, because essentially in Sudan you did have this state sponsor of terrorism determination. You had some changes in the government that seemed like they were moving in the right direction. You had a good reason to keep watching, because Sudan has not been a constantly stable situation since the sanctions were lifted. But let's talk a little bit about the mechanics. And Collmann, if you want to just talk a little bit about how were Sudanese sanctions in place, executive order, statute, and then how were they lifted?
So Sudan was, it's interesting because Sudan was kind of being lifted as I was getting into sanctions. So I remember this process happening. But so there was a series of executive orders that imposed comprehensive sanctions in response to the bad activity of Omar al-Bashir, the former president of Sudan. And then after it seemed as if Omar al-Bashir was sort of cooperating with the process, those executive orders were gradually rescinded, also by executive order. And so we saw a sort of similar to what we're seeing in Syria now, removal of the restrictions on imports, on exports of services, on investment, allowing for dealings with the government of Sudan, etc. I think one particular interesting parallel for Syria is the state sponsor of terror issue.
Yep.
The sanctions were the lifting sort of began in 2017 by executive order, but the export embargo was not removed until 2020. So Sudan remained in country group E, which is the sort of most restricted country group under the EAR. All items subject to the EAR, sometimes with exceptions for food or medicine. And that state sponsor of terror process, that unwinding process, just took a couple of years. The executive branch had to be comfortable making the necessary certifications to Congress, and that's what it took to get them out of export controls.
Yeah, I think they had to extend the general licenses a couple of times because of that. The general license came into place. I think the plan originally was for it to be in place for 6 months. Got extended at least once by President Trump in his first term. So you had this process that took a little longer than was anticipated, as you pointed out, Collmann. So why don't we talk a little bit about? Well, I mean, this happened with Myanmar. This also happened with Sudan. Sometimes the situation changes and some of the sanctions come back, right? I mean, that's another thing to think about, and certainly to think about with respect to Syria.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, so we sort of alluded to that a little bit with when we talked about Myanmar. The situation improves, sanctions are removed, and then we have a military coup. And so then, we have maybe a new executive order imposing blocking sanctions on bad actors, maybe sort of restrictions targeting an aspect of the Myanmar military. In Sudan, we've seen the outbreak of the Sudanese civil war, and so we actually do have an executive order in response to that, 14098, sanctions on persons destabilizing Sudan and undermining a goal of democratic transition. Go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to say they don't ever really end, right? I mean, so you get to a point where you've lifted, and then sometimes the situation changes and they come back. So it's the zombie sanctions.
Yeah, it's sort of a philosophical question. Is it the sanctions are not ending, or the troubles in that particular part of the world are not ending? I think we could sort of spin that out. Is it OFAC or is it Sudan?
Right.
But either way, if there have been sanctions in a jurisdiction before, there's maybe a greater likelihood that sanctions will reoccur in that same place.
Well, let's talk about another part of the world where there's been a lot of change over the last 25 years, sometimes good, sometimes bad. I noticed that sitting behind you seems to be a gold map of Iraq. Am I right about that?
Let me bring this up for the YouTube viewers. Yes, this is a golden plaque, and as you can see on here, it says Iraqi funds for asset recovery. So this was something that the team got when I was at OFAC from the government of Iraq. There's an exception for plaques you can get, and then as I was leaving OFAC, the team sort of gave this to me as a joke.
So that's not an emolument, because it is an exception for blacks.
There's
Good to know. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about Iraq? I mean, Iraq was under sanctions certainly during the Saddam Hussein era, which ended in 2003. How come you're getting a plaque in 2020, whatever, for working with Iraq? And why does it relate to sanctions?
I think the Iraq program is sort of fascinating. It's sort of everything that has happened in Iraq. At some point later happens elsewhere in the world, sanctions wise. But so there's actually 3 Iraq programs: Iraq 1, Iraq 2, and Iraq 3. So Iraq 1 is the sort of traditional comprehensive embargo dating back from the 1990s, in response to the Iraqi
Desert Storm. Is it Desert
Yes.
Storm? I think that was Desert Storm.
Yeah. The back to Kuwait.
Right.
And so that was, blocking imports, exports, investment, etc.
So Iraq was like Iran, right? Like Iran, right? But back in the
Yes, but they hadn't not as much derivative or secondary sanctions yet.
Got it.
But
So basically a comprehensive primary sanctions embargo, but no secondary sanctions.
that's right. Yes. And then so the invasion of Iraq happened, and then Iraq 1 sort of disappeared in this, in a way that I don't think has happened to any other sanctions program. It ended in what's called confiscation and vesting, which is a rarely used procedure under Section 1702 of IEPA, which the trigger is armed hostilities or attack by a foreign country or foreign nationals. But in those cases, the president actually has the power to confiscate blocked property and vest it somewhere else. So transfer the title. So that happened to all of the assets that were blocked under Iraq 1. And they were transferred to something called the Development Fund of Iraq, which was sort of an intent to rebuild Iraq following Saddam Hussein's rule and the U.S. invasion. So as they were winding down Iraq 1, they created a new program, Iraq 2. And what Iraq 2 was intended to do was sort of go after the assets of the regime or its members that had been hidden outside of Iraq.
The Swiss bank accounts, basically, and wherever else they were.
Exactly, the Swiss bank accounts. So one guy who comes to mind here is a guy named Khalaf al-Dulaimi, who was put on the list, I think in 1992 or early 90s. And he was, part of his job for the regime was sort of hiding assets of the regime overseas. So he was sanctioned for many years, including after his death, while these assets were found and then unblocked so they could be returned to Iraq. So there's actually still folks on the list under Iraq 2. I think it's a couple dozen, actually. And so a lot of them have probably passed away already. But they're still, they're still on the list because there may be assets out there somewhere in Switzerland that OFAC wants to keep blocked so that they can be found and returned to Iraq. And then finally, there's Iraq 3, which is 2004. And that one, you can, if you remember the war in Iraq, you can sort of guess what was going on there. It was a response to the insurgency. And so it was sort of blocking bad actors and their financiers who were supporting the insurgency against U.S. forces in Iraq.
So it was essentially responding to an entirely new foreign policy crisis that arose out of kind of the overthrow of the government of Iraq and kind of the for lack of a better word, kind of the power vacuum in Iraq that resulted in insurgency, and the U.S. was trying to use sanctions to deter the insurgency, or at least trying to control the financing with request to the insurgency.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's Iraq is actually a fascinating sanctions place. There's a at least when I was there was a treasury attaché in Baghdad who had one of the most interesting jobs in the U.S. government. But there's all sorts of counterterrorism sanctions issues in Iraq. There's obviously Iran sanctions issues in Iraq. It's a good place to have strong sanctions compliance programs in place.
To all our Iraqi listeners out there, that is something that you should be thinking about, particularly with respect to the Iraq 3 sanctions. Those are still in place, right?
Yes, they're still in place. I think there's still a couple people on the list under Iraq 3.
And it's all list-based?
Iraq 3 is all list-based, yeah.
Got it. All right. So where does the plaque come from?
The plaque is the Iraqi Fund for Assets Recovery is actually the government body that's sort of charged with finding these Saddam-era assets around the world and bringing them back to Iraq. And so, as you might imagine, there's engagement between that body and OFAC.
Right. Well, because Iraq 2, right, was designed to freeze a lot of those assets to the extent it was possible.
Exactly. Yeah.
And a lot of them, I'm assuming, when the Iraqi governmental body finds them, they still need to try and unfreeze them at that point so that they can use them.
Yeah, they need to unfreeze them. They need to. So that's an engagement with OFAC, and OFAC wants to make sure that they're not diverted. Sort of those kinds of concerns. So.
And just, I mean, in general terms, to the extent you can, kind of what's the process? So essentially, somebody comes to OFAC and says, we're the legitimate government of Iraq now. We've found these assets. We think you're blocking these assets. We'd like you to unfreeze these assets. Do they file an application? Is this done all kind of in diplomatic meetings? What is the process if there is one?
So it's remarkably similar to the process that, like the services that we would provide for a client, like a license application or a delisting application. Every now and then you'll see a Iraq 2 person delisted. And it was, in rare cases, OFAC can sort of sua sponte delist somebody. But it often actually does begin with a delisting petition. Maybe it's from the government of Iraq, but it's a very similar process. Very similar sort of things that OFAC is looking for as well.
Interesting. So basically looking at, is this somebody where there's changed behavior where if we unfreeze these assets, they're not going to be used in exactly the way that we were trying to stop when we froze them? Yeah.
I mean, yes. You can just sort of think hypothetically when especially for somebody who's dead.
Right.
When you unfreeze them, where are the assets going to go?
Right. Well, because, and that would be a reason not to unfreeze, the assets of somebody who's dead, because essentially you thought that they were ill-gotten gains, and if you unfreeze the assets, then their next of kin is going to essentially be able to take them, right? And so, or whoever their heirs are, and so you're trying to make sure that there's actually a process for deciding what happens to them, as opposed to just letting them go by default.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Well, that is very interesting. So I think that covers kind of the history and the current and maybe the ancient history on this. Anybody want to talk about some lessons learned? I mean, I'll throw one last question out there for both of you, and why don't you start with this, Melissa? If you were going to tell OFAC, or OFAC came to you and said, what should we be thinking about in connection with, lifting the sanctions on Syria? Because we were watching the same as you, President Trump in Saudi Arabia, without much notice to anybody. We're finding it out when you are, just said the sanctions are going to go away, and now we're trying to think, okay, we've done this before, but what's our checklist? Like, what should we be looking at?
Well, first step, of course, is checking all the statutory authorities for anything to make sure you have reporting requirements are things you can't do without some type of congressional sign-off. And then, there's probably a lot of coordination with BIS as they're thinking about what are we doing about those export controls piece of it. If they move from country group E to D, which parts of D, we're probably keeping that arms embargo in place for a bit. We're probably keeping, kind of all those restrictions. Are we going to do things like maybe make additions to the entity list? Because we haven't had to deal with a bunch of these entities because everyone's all blocked. So why would we put them on the entity list? They're already blocked under the comprehensive sanctions. But, maybe now we see a few more designations as an effect of the general geographic block being lifted. We saw that with Zimbabwe. We're not lifting the sanctions on you. We're just changing the name of the program that applies because the rationale is the same. So I think there's probably a bit like that going on. Not necessarily, at least for new designations, probably not happening quickly, just from the optics foreign policy perspective. But I won't be shocked if we see some new designations as part of the general lifting or temporary lifting. I also won't be shocked if we see tweaks to GLs or on the BIS side of, we're trying this interim final rule because we're not ready to go final, and and we're going to keep thinking about that one, and maybe more of a drip if things seem to be progressing well as hoped.
Which is why this stuff takes time, right? I mean, There's a lot to think about. Collmann, put your BIS and your OFAC hats back on. Any final thoughts about kind of advice you'd give to your old colleagues about how to unwind some of these programs? What should they be thinking about?
The only other thing that I would add to Melissa's excellent summary is to think about it the UN angle, which we haven't really talked about, but you see that with Libya, actually. Because I know we were sort of chatting about this offline, Tim, and afterwards I went and looked it up. And there's the executive order, the U.S. executive order freezing Libyan assets, but then there's also a UN Security Council resolution freezing UN assets, and UNSCR resolution 1970. And so that's going to make things a lot more difficult, because it's going to make it much harder for OFAC to unilaterally unfreeze assets. It's also going to mean that, a country like Germany, which takes its UN obligations very seriously, is not going to want to unfreeze assets as well. So in addition to everything Melissa just said, if you see a reference to the UN Participation Act in the relevant sanctions program, it could be a more bureaucratic process that involves not only the US, but Russia, China, UK, and France.
And it also may be, in addition to that, and kind of related, Collmann, is that I'm guessing that the folks in the U.S. government and in foreign governments are thinking about, well, I'm guessing the Assad regime had some assets that may be hidden around the world. What are you going to do about those? And how are the lifting of the designations going to affect those? And then, and how does the new government deal with those if it's going to try and collect them and return them to the Syrian people? Yeah. So I think those are all thoughts that are going on at this point. And it was good to have this conversation, I think, because, who knows what's going to happen in the coming weeks and months, but there's reports that there are negotiations with respect to the Iran sanctions right now, and negotiations certainly with respect to the Russia sanctions. And so this is probably an issue that we're going to talk about again.
Just maybe.
All right. Well, thank you both for coming on. Collmann, thank you. And Melissa, thank you. And for everyone else, thank you for listening, and stay sanctions free.
Produced by Heartcast Media.